press fit. There is a small amount of metal between the stones that will have to be removed. Now, I like to do this now. It's easier to do this now with a narrow flat graver than to do it after the stones are set. This also helps to define the beads. Also, I like to make bead isolating cuts into the stone seat to further define the area for the slightly larger single beads that will secure the two stones. These I cut with a narrow graver. Here the same double-aught point graver I used earlier for making bead isolating cuts, cutting down rather steeply into the stone seat area and in about the position you see here. Again, this is somewhat of a judgment call, and here too some practice helps lead the way. On this setting exercise, I will use one bead in the center of the end stones and taper the bright cut into a point at each end, as you saw in that curved example I showed you earlier. So, after removing any burrs, cleaning the mounting and the stones, we're ready for the bead raising ceremony. I start all the common beads with a tool made from one of the small tapered points. This time with the face ground farther back for a slightly larger round face. These beads will be slightly larger since they are common beads for two stones. I raise these beads in the same manner as I did for the single beads I raised earlier, starting at a relatively high angle, about 45 or 50 degrees, and begin to bring them up alternately from side to side so as not to tilt the stones. I progressively bring them up along with the end beads, working around them several times until I have the stones firmly seated. Now, on this setting, I'll now form the beads with a beading tool, using a slightly larger one for the interior beads and a smaller one for the end beads. Picking the appropriate size beading tool again is a matter of judgment, and a bit of trial and error will make it obvious. Too large a tool will not form a full bead, and you may damage the stone with the edge of the beading tool, or you're even more likely to damage your beading tool. On the other hand, too small a tool will cause too much metal to squeeze out around the edges. A little bit of excess metal is probably desirable, as it's difficult to provide exactly the right amount of metal every time. A small amount is relatively easy to clean up with a sharp point graver or a narrow flat graver, but an excess is considerably more difficult. Now I use a narrow point graver and cut along the edges to remove some excess metal prior to bright cutting. And note that because of the position of the beads, this is virtually a straight cut along the length of the edge. I do have to make a slight curve at the ends to end up with a point behind those centered end beads. Then I use a flat graver to do the bright cutting. Again, this is a straight cut down each side with a slight turn at the ends, as you see. Here, as always, you need your graver really sharp and polished, and be sure to get your tongue in the right position, most commonly protruding just slightly out of the corner of your mouth. Bright cutting is a task that I never know when I'm through. Most likely I just get tired and quit. Finally, I touch up the beads again with the beading tool, trim excess metal around the beads, and hit a lick with the polishing brush charged with polishing compound. Now, of course, it would be ideal if these stones were set girdle to girdle. If I were to do that, I would start by preparing the seat for a center stone and then carefully work out to the ends. Setting exactly girdle to girdle cuts your allowable tolerance virtually to zero, so it must be done with more precision and is more time consuming. When you get to this point, you can call yourself a master machinist. I'll move this over now and we'll set these other 4 stones with the greater space between them. And as I told you, I will use an alternate method for preparing the seats for these stones. I believe the setting burr size problem is the reason many diamond setters prefer to cut the seats with round or bud burrs. And I'll use some illustrations here to explain how and why this works. A seat is cut, usually with a round or bud burr slightly larger in diameter than the stone, about 1/10 of a millimeter larger, and to a depth that the stone fits to a suitable depth. Again, the table about level with the surface. These illustrations show holes prepared with 2 different burr configurations, a round burr and a bud burr, and here's one as would be cut with a tapered burr. Some tapered burrs are available with a 14-degree included angle. I don't think it makes any difference what the hole shape is. The stone seats at a tapered contact point in all cases. Of course, the stone isn't seated on a ledge as it is used when you use a setting burr, but what's the difference? The beads hold the stone down and it can't go deeper. The hole gets smaller. And with this method, the girdle does always rest tight in the seat, whereas with setting burrs, a tight fit is extremely difficult to achieve. Here's what we need to understand. My machinery's handbook tells me that a contact angle of less than 16 degrees included angle is a locking taper. A reasonably round stone will lock in that hole. If we use too large a round or bud burr, the contact angle will be greater than 16 degrees, and we've created a ball joint. The stone then won't stay where it's put. It'll scoot around in that hole like a raw oyster in a soup spoon. So the thing we want to do is stay under that magic angle of 16 degrees. The advantage of using this principle is that you can seat a number of stones that have minor variation in size with the same burr. You just go down with the burr to a proper depth for a particular stone. This works as long as the contact angle remains in the locking taper category, under 16 degrees. Stone setters who become skilled with this method become efficient at setting a lot of stones quickly and with a minimum inventory of burrs. The only problems I have with this method are getting the stone positioned level with the surface, and if I get too enthusiastic in pressing the stone into the hole, I can chip or flake the stone, especially softer ones, some synthetics and CZs, etc. Here I believe you're applying exactly the type of pressure the Indians made use of to flake arrowheads. Now back to the setting job. And I have a round burr that measures 2.1 millimeters in diameter. The stones I've selected are right at 2 millimeter. With the burr lubed, I run the burr down until it's almost half its diameter in the metal. To save time, I'll start all the holes. I'm sure they will all have to go deeper, but I'll have to fit each stone by the old cut and try method, getting a depth such that the table of each stone is level with the surface. Even if the stones measure the same diameter, they can vary in crown height and girdle thickness, so each seat may have to be slightly different. Remember, I must remove the metal ridge or burr off the surface of the plate to help judge the depth and get down to a clean surface. When I'm satisfied with the depth of the seats, I clean the mounting and the stones and place them back in position, leveling them up and pushing them down to lock them in the taper. On these practice stones, I have to be extra careful. Excessive pressure can easily chip a stone by causing an edge to flake. Getting these stones positioned level with the surface causes me the most difficulty using this tapered seat method, because the stone will lock in that taper at any angle, and once it locks, it's virtually impossible to move. I usually have to remove it and start over. But I really think most of my problem in this regard is due to the age of this pair of eyes I'm using. Sometimes I just don't recognize the fact that a stone is slightly off before I set it, and then it's too late. And now, using one of the small points sharpened on the end at a 55-degree angle to make a small round graver, I proceed to start the beads. Of course, you can use one of the other bead raising gravers if you prefer. I start the beads starting back about 3/4 of a millimeter, and I really think it helps to scribe the bead center lines on the surface to keep them reasonably in the desired location. I go down one side, starting beads in one direction on each stone. Then I turn around and begin to bring up the opposing beads. And then, of course, do the same for the remaining beads. Finally, I go back over all of them, setting them down securely against the stone. One nice characteristic of this locking taper method of creating the seat is that it's not as likely that you will tilt the stone with the bead raising process. They seem to lock firmly in that taper. Now I use a narrow point graver and remove some unwanted metal as I did on the larger stones. I start near the center of the stones and make a cut past the beads along the outside margins. Of course, cutting carefully past each bead. This time I'll do the same in that center island of metal between the stones. And on these small stone settings, incidentally, it's entirely possible to skip the use of the point graver and use the flat graver to remove this metal and just continue on to complete the bright cutting. Then, using one of the small beading tools, I define the beads. Just proceed around the setting, forming each bead in turn. I'll hit them a final lick again later after I've done the bright cutting. And with my flat graver, I begin the bright cutting, going down each side from corner to corner, making several passes, usually in both directions. The idea here, of course, is to finish up with a nice, smooth, bright surface, and I treat the ends in the same manner, ending up with a miter in the corner. Now I start near the center of each stone and cut past each bead, cutting at a slight angle such that 4 cuts past each bead with the flat graver leaves a diamond-shaped pyramid of metal between the stones. This is the space filler, and I like to do it in such a manner that it comes to a relatively sharp point at the center. You can use a beading tool and bead this little island of metal. That's a matter of personal preference. I think it looks nice just leaving the diamond shape. What you want to avoid is leaving a noticeable flat area of the original surface of the plate. This stands out like a toad in a punch bowl. From now on, I redo the beads a bit, do some cleanup of excess metal around the beads, and perhaps touch up the bright cutting a bit in areas that I'm most dissatisfied with. As I told you before, I'm never really satisfied with my work, but eventually quit and hit it with a polishing brush and compound. Polishing it a bit really does wonders to improve the appearance. Sometimes even leads me to believe I can salvage the job. At any rate, I hope I've dispelled some notion that seating stones, raising beads, bright cutting, and finishing a setting like this is an activity that only the big boys can handle. I get a tremendous sense of satisfaction decorating a blank band of metal in this manner, and I'm sure you'll find it equally rewarding. I want to go back and show you this other string of stones again for comparison, and then we'll back away so that you can see both of them. One thing I would like to point out on this one with the tapered ends, it would look much more graceful if the end stones were slightly smaller. Then the bright cut taper would have a more gradual, pleasant curve.
We've reached the end of the time we have available, and fortunately, also the end of my memory assurance notes. I've concentrated mostly on what I consider my areas of expertise, metalworking and engraving, as I firmly believe that help in these 2 areas is more important than showing you a greater variety of settings, because machining and engraving skills are the foundation skills. From now on, your diligent practice and further study in sources such as the books I've shown you will make it easier to understand and accomplish these and even more complicated settings, and settings that may not involve bead or bright cut tasks. I enjoyed showing you the techniques you've just seen, at least after a first bit of apprehension when I started the actual setting demonstrations. I sincerely hope that what you've seen will be of benefit to you. And perhaps someday our paths will cross somewhere down the road and we can share our further experiences and growth in this rewarding and challenging field of bead and bright cut diamond setting.